Picture this sunny July afternoon
Yeah.
in Paris in 1791. Crowds, music, laughter. The city's buzzing with excitement. It's Bastille Day, the anniversary of that iconic storming of the Bastille.
Right.
But it's not just a celebration this time.
Mm.
Thousands are gathered at the Champ de Mars signing a petition demanding an end to the monarchy.
Wow.
Can you imagine such a bold move just a year after the revolution started?
It's pretty amazing.
We're going deep into the summer of 1791. This is a pivotal period in the French Revolution, and we've got historical accounts, newspaper articles, even song lyrics to help us understand how France went from this, joyous celebration to the edge of chaos in just a few months.
Yeah, that shift in tone is really interesting. In 1790, King Louis VI was practically the guest of honor at the Bastille Day celebrations. He swore an oath to the Constitution, and it seemed like he was embracing the revolution. But just a year later, there's a really deliberate absence of any royal symbols. The word king was even erased from the altar of the fatherland, and the anthem for that year, God of the People and of Kings, it kind of reflects this growing resentment towards the monarchy. It's a stark contrast to the celebratory mood of the previous year.
It sounds like a simmering tension, beneath the surface of the celebrations, especially considering Louis XVI attempted escape just a month before Bastille Day. That had to be a major turning point, don't you think?
Oh, absolutely. The flight to Varennes, as it's called, was a real game changer. Imagine the king and queen disguised fleeing Paris in the middle of the night, hoping to join up with royalist forces and maybe even launch a counter-revolution. But they were caught in Varennes and brought back to Paris. The public was outraged not only by the escape itself, but by a letter the king left behind. He basically denounced the revolution and all the reforms it had achieved.
Oh, wow. Talk about adding fuel to the fire.
Exactly.
So how did this escape attempt change the public's perception of the monarchy? Did it immediately create this widespread distrust?
Before Varennes, the press, even the more radical publications were pretty hesitant to directly criticize Louis XVI. They often blamed his advisors. But after that escape attempt, all bets were off. Radical newspapers like Père Duchesne, they started openly denouncing the king, calling him a traitor, a coward. Yeah. And their depictions of Marie Antoinette were even worse.
Wow, you can almost feel the anger and betrayal, just in those words.
Oh, yeah.
So with the monarchy's image tarnished and public distrust growing, how did the different factions within the revolution respond to this crisis?
Well, it's fascinating how this event really brought those existing divisions to the forefront. You had moderates like Antoine Barnave, who, even after everything that happened, still believed that the revolution had essentially run its course. They wanted stability, and they thought a constitutional monarchy with limited but not eliminated powers for the king was the best way forward.
So even after this betrayal, the moderates still saw a role for the king.
Right.
What about the people who wanted more radical change? Were they starting to push for a republic at this point?
Oh, absolutely. The Cordelier Club, with figures like Camille Desmoulins, Jean-Paul Marat, and Georges Danton, they were adamant that the monarchy had to go. They argued that Louis XVI had proven himself completely untrustworthy and that the only way to secure real liberty was to establish a republic. And their voices grew louder and more influential as the summer went on.
So you have this clash of visions for the future of France, and it's playing out against this backdrop of simmering tension. Was there a specific event that really pushed things over the edge?
There was an incident that became known as the massacre at the Champ de Mars. It happened just 3 days after that Bastille Day celebration we were talking about. The Cordeliers had organized this massive gathering at the Champ de Mars to present a petition. They were demanding Louis VI's abdication and the establishment of a republic. But things took a dark turn.
Right. You mentioned something about two men hiding under an altar. What happened there?
So 2 men were found hiding under the platform where the altar of the fatherland stood. One was a wig maker and the other was an older man with a wooden leg. They had a picnic basket and some carpentry tools with them. Historians think they were probably just upskirters, planning to look under women's skirts as they signed the petition. But in that climate of fear and paranoia, rumors started flying that they were royalist agents planting a bomb. The crowd, totally gripped by terror, seized them, hanged them from a lamppost, and then beheaded them.
That's a really chilling reminder of how quickly fear can distort perceptions and lead to violence. So how did this incident, with all its, gruesome details, contribute to those escalating anxieties within the revolution?
Well, this event sent shockwaves through Paris. News of the lynching reached Jean-Sylvain Bailly, the mayor of Paris, and the Marquis de Lafayette, commander of the National Guard, fearing a larger plot against the revolution. Bailly declared martial law and ordered Lafayette and the National Guard to disperse the gathering at the Champ de Mars.
So you have this mass gathering already on edge, and then the National Guard arrives. What happened next?
Well, the Champ de Mars was packed with tens of thousands of people. Some were there to support the petition, others were just enjoying a Sunday outing. But as Lafayette's troops marched into the stadium, the atmosphere became incredibly tense. People started booing, some threw stones, and then suddenly a shot rang out. No one knows for sure who fired it, but the National Guard, thinking they were under attack, opened fire on the crowd.
Oh, wow. It sounds utterly chaotic. Was there any attempt to de-escalate the situation, or did it just descend into violence?
It was pure pandemonium. People were screaming, trying to escape as the National Guard fired into the crowd. Cavalry charged in, trampling people under their horses' hooves. The firing only lasted a few minutes, but when it was over, dozens lay dead and hundreds more were wounded.
What a horrifying tragedy. How did this massacre impact the course of the revolution? Did it embolden the moderates or the radicals?
The massacre at the Champ de Mars had a profound impact. It further deepened the divisions within the revolution. For the moderates like Barnave and Lafayette, this event confirmed their fears about the revolution spiraling out of control. They saw it as a stark warning about the dangers of mob rule and believed that a firm hand was needed to restore order. They blamed the radicals, accusing them of inciting the violence, and pushed for a crackdown on dissent.
So the moderates saw this as a justification for a more controlled approach. How did the radicals interpret the massacre?
For the radicals, this event was undeniable proof that the moderates had sided with the monarchy and were willing to use force against the people. They saw Lafayette and Bailly as enemies of the revolution, accusing them of conspiring with Marie Antoinette to crush the movement for a republic. Suspicion and animosity grew on both sides, setting the stage for even more conflict.
With this horrific event and the growing divide between factions, it seems like the revolution was at a crossroads. A new constitution was on the horizon, but the king was secretly plotting against it. This is where a figure like Robespierre starts to gain prominence, right?
Precisely. While figures like Barnave had initially been hailed as the rising stars of the revolution, the events of that tumultuous summer pushed Robespierre into the spotlight. This austere, morally unyielding figure, renowned for his fiery speeches and unwavering commitment to the common people, emerged as the champion of the radical cause.
So we left off with this kind of uneasy tension, a new constitution promising change, but a king who seemed determined to sabotage it. It feels like a ticking time bomb. Did the moderates actually think this delicate balance of power could hold?
Well, it's striking that Barnave and his allies genuinely seemed to think they'd found a workable compromise with this new constitution. They really underestimated both Louis VI's cunning and the growing appeal of radical ideas among the people of Paris.
So while the moderates were celebrating, were the seeds of future conflict already being sown?
Exactly. This constitution, which was adopted in September 1791, was supposed to create a constitutional monarchy. Louis VI was still the king, but his powers were severely limited. A single-chamber legislative assembly would be in charge of making laws, and the king kept the right to veto any legislation he didn't like.
So a system of checks and balances, at least on paper. Did it actually satisfy any of the key players?
It pleased practically no one. The radicals saw it as way too weak. It left too much power in the hands of a king they simply couldn't trust. They argued that the voting restrictions, which were based on property ownership, excluded the very people who'd made the revolution possible, the urban working class and the peasantry.
And what about Louis VI? Did he genuinely accept this reduction in his authority?
Publicly, yes. He swore an oath to uphold the Constitution, and there were celebrations all over Paris. But privately, Louis was already working to dismantle it. He was secretly communicating with other European monarchs, especially Emperor Leopold II of Austria, who was his brother-in-law. He was looking for their help in restoring his absolute power.
So the king was playing a double game, all smiles on the surface, but plotting behind the scenes. Do we have any evidence of this?
We do. We have letters written by both Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette that reveal their real intentions. Marie Antoinette, in her letters, called the revolutionaries brutes and madmen. Louis was begging Leopold II for military intervention. He claimed he was a prisoner of the revolution.
This raises a big question. If Louis VI never planned to honor the Constitution, why even bother accepting it? What was his goal?
It was a strategic move. By seeming to accept the Constitution, Louis bought himself some time. He knew that outright defiance would probably mean he'd be removed from power immediately. By pretending to cooperate, he hoped to make the revolutionaries think everything was fine, while he secretly rallied support for a counter-revolution.
A risky gamble for sure. So while this political chess match was happening, what was the mood in Paris? Did people feel calmer after the Constitution was adopted, or was there still a lot of fear and suspicion?
That climate of fear we talked about, it actually got worse after the Champ de Mars massacre. Both the moderates and the radicals were convinced that enemies of the revolution were everywhere plotting to destroy everything they'd fought for.
So people were constantly paranoid. How did this suspicion show up in everyday life?
Imagine living in a world where you're encouraged to report anyone you even think might be against the revolution. Neighbors turned on each other, friends turned on each other. It became a twisted sense of duty to report any sign of disloyalty, even if it wasn't real.
That's a pretty disturbing thought. And it sounds kind of familiar, doesn't it? Like some of the things we see happening today.
Right.
Are there any examples of how this culture of suspicion actually played out?
Timothy Tackett, a historian who's written a lot about this period, he uses the region of Brittany as an example. After Louis VI tried to escape to Varennes, the authorities in Brittany cracked down on anyone they thought might be sympathetic to the king. They arrested people, searched homes, and even intercepted mail. When people questioned how harsh they were being, they said they had to be extra vigilant to protect the revolution from its enemies.
It sounds like the revolution was eating itself alive.
Mm-hmm.
So while Louis VI was plotting to get his power back, Robespierre was building his reputation as the voice of the radical opposition. What were Robespierre's main criticisms of the new constitution and the leadership of the moderates?
Robespierre thought the Constitution was a complete betrayal of what the revolution stood for. He said it didn't really guarantee the rights and freedoms of ordinary people. He especially criticized the voting restrictions, which he said left out the people who had driven the revolution. He also condemned the fact that the king still had veto power. He thought that was a dangerous loophole that let the monarchy block the will of the people. And his words resonated with a lot of people who felt like the revolution had lost its way.
So we have this very volatile situation. Robespierre is getting more popular with his fiery speeches. The king is secretly scheming to undermine the new system. And there's this atmosphere of paranoia and distrust everywhere. The year 1791 is coming to an end. What's next?
France is about to go to war.
War with who? And what led to that?
The war that broke out in 1792 is a complicated event with a lot of contributing factors. But basically, it's a clash between the revolutionary ideas spreading through France and the traditional monarchies of Europe who saw those ideas as a direct threat to their own power and stability.
So it's not just internal conflict, but external pressure that's pushing France toward war. It feels like the revolution's about to enter a whole new, much more dangerous phase.
It is. The war will completely change the revolution. It'll unleash forces that are even more radical and violent than anything we've seen so far. It'll test the very core of the French Republic and lead to a period of unimaginable terror.
We left off with France on the brink of war in 1792. What were the things that finally pushed them over the edge?
Well, it's really important to remember that internal turmoil we've been talking about.
Right.
The divisions, the anxiety, all of that play a role. But we can't ignore those powerful external forces either. The other European monarchies were watching everything happening in France with this, growing sense of dread. They saw this revolution with its ideas about liberty, equality, and popular sovereignty as a dangerous contagion, something that could undermine their own authority.
So it wasn't just about France itself. They were worried these revolutionary ideas might spread and inspire uprisings in their own countries.
Exactly. The monarchs of Austria, Prussia, and other powerful states saw the French Revolution as an existential threat to their power. They were terrified that their own people might start demanding similar reforms inspired by what was happening in France. They felt they had to contain it, and if that meant military intervention, well, so be it.
That makes sense. But didn't Louis XVI also play a part in pushing France towards war? Wasn't he secretly hoping for foreign intervention to help him regain his absolute power?
That's a key piece of the puzzle. While the foreign monarchs were driven by fear, Louis VI saw war as a chance to get his power back. He believed that if France was defeated by foreign powers, it would make the revolution look bad, and he could seize control again. He and Marie Antoinette were actually encouraging Emperor Leopold II of Austria to intervene militarily. They were doing this through their secret correspondence.
So we've got foreign monarchs worried about revolution spreading and Louis XVI is trying to use the situation to his advantage. Was there a specific event that actually triggered the declaration of war?
Well, tensions were rising rapidly in the early months of 1792. The Legislative Assembly, which was mostly made up of moderate revolutionaries, became increasingly suspicious of Louis VI's motives. They passed a series of laws to limit the king's power and strengthen the nation's defenses. But Louis, feeling confident because of the support he'd been promised from Austria, vetoed those laws. And that just made things worse.
So it sounds like he was deliberately provoking the assembly, almost daring them to challenge him. How did they react?
The assembly wasn't going to back down. They were determined to assert their authority. So in April 1792, they declared war on Austria. They thought a quick victory would secure the revolution and expose the king's treachery. What they didn't realize was how weak the French army was. Years of neglect under the old regime had left it unprepared and poorly led.
So they went into a war they weren't ready for?
It was a huge mistake. The first few battles were disastrous for the French-Prussian troops. Joined forces with Austria, and they invaded France. They advanced quickly towards Paris. Panic gripped the capital as news of these defeats spread. Rumors started circulating that royalist supporters in the city were planning to revolt and help the Prussians.
So they have foreign armies approaching and a possible counter-revolution brewing in their own city. It sounds like the revolution was about to fall apart.
Things were very bad. The Legislative Assembly, fearing the worst, took some drastic steps. They stripped Louis XVI of all his remaining power and imprisoned him along with Marie Antoinette and their children. They called for a national convention to write a new constitution, one that would establish a republic and permanently get rid of the monarchy.
That's a huge turning point. The monarchy is over, and France becomes a republic facing threats both inside and outside its borders. This is when the Reign of Terror begins, right?
Exactly. The summer of 1792 marks a turning point. It's a moment of both liberation and looming disaster. The revolution had achieved its initial goals, overthrowing the absolute monarchy and creating a more representative government. But it had also unleashed these forces of radicalism, violence, and paranoia that would be incredibly difficult to control.
What about Robespierre? What happens to him in all of this?
Robespierre becomes one of the most powerful and controversial figures in this new radical phase of the revolution. He uses his influence to shape the course of the terror, and he becomes both its architect and eventually one of its victims.
As 1791 came to an end, France was on the edge of a new and turbulent era. It's a powerful reminder that revolutions, while they often start with noble goals, can take unexpected and sometimes terrifying turns. Even the most passionate revolutionaries can become victims of the forces they unleash. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into a pivotal summer in the French Revolution.